Welcome to our audience online and here in the Blue Zone at COP26 in Glasgow. Thank you for joining us for this EU Pavilion Side event, brought together by JPI Climate, the Joint Programming Initiative, the Agence Française de Développement, the 5th European Climate Change Adaptation Conference, ECA, the Cascades Project, our Ouda NEPAD Development Agency of the African Union, and the National Adaptation Plans Global Network. My name is Sally Stevens. I lead on communications and engagement for Space for Climate, which represents the UK Earth Observation Community, and also for the Institute for Environmental Analytics, both based at University of Reading. I want to tell you that I am not a scientist. I am a journalist by background, and I have already warned our speakers today that I will be rudely interrupting them if they use acronyms or technical terms that I don't feel we're all familiar with in the aims of plain language science communication. There's a few housekeeping notices before I introduce our panel. For those in the room, please make sure your mobile phones are on silent, and do feel free to take notes to ask questions. If you're joining us online, you can submit your questions and comments in the live discussion on the EU Side Events website. Now, enough from me. I'm delighted to introduce to you our fantastic panel of experts here today, who have given up their time to share their expertise and experiences with us. Carla Montesi is the Director in the European Commission for the Green Deal and Digital Agenda in the Directorate General for International Partnerships. Her brief covers policy on climate change, environment, sustainable energy, agri-food systems and transport, technology and digitalisation. Carla has also served as Director for Directorate Planet and Prosperity, and before that was Director for Western and Central Africa. Frank McGovern is the Chief Climate Scientist at Environmental Protection Agency Ireland, and he is Chair of JPI Climate. He has wide experience of development of international programmes and processes on climate change, UN negotiations, and international policy development, and specialises in the science policy interface. Dr. Hannah Knappen is Policy Officer, Climate Change and Sustainable Food Systems at the European Centre for Development Policy Management. She works mostly on adaptation in a Europe-Africa context. Hannah is also a contributor to Cascades, an EU Horizon 2020 project that focuses on how transboundary climate impacts might affect Europe and how to respond to them. And Hannah is joining us from Brussels. Katie Harris is a Senior Programme Officer with the African Union and an expert in climate change and environmental governance, with a particular focus on climate policy, diplomacy, security and human development. So I do apologise. Katie has a particular focus on global governance of climate change adaptation and cascading climate risk, how the impacts of climate change and indeed of adaptation responses in one place affect other communities. Katie is also a contributor to the Cascades project. And now it is Kwame Ababio's turn. Kwame is Senior Programme Officer with the African Union and an expert in climate change and environmental governance, with a particular focus on climate policy, diplomacy, security and human development. Kwame has 15 years of experience across the breadth of developmental work at regional and national level in Africa, most recently with the new Climate Centre for Resilience and Adaptations, partnering with Walker Institute at the University of Reading. And Christophe Buffet is Programme Manager at Adaptation with the Agence Française de Développement. His expertise includes climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, COP negotiations, climate change policy, and community-based adaptation. Apologies, Katie, for bungling your introduction. Each panellist is going to give a 3-minute overview to build some context around our theme, which is adaptation beyond the EU, perspectives for stronger cooperation with Africa. The new EU adaptation strategy underlines the need to better link internal and external dimensions of adaptation with partner countries, especially Africa. Each panellist is going to give a 3-minute overview to build some context around our theme. And first, I invite Carla to give us a brief overview of the European Commission's adaptation plans in Africa in the context of the new EU adaptation strategy. Thank you, Carla.
Many, many thanks, Sally, and good afternoon to all of you here in Glasgow or online. I'm very glad to share this, some overview of this important subject on cooperation between the European Union and Africa on adaptation to climate change. Sally, you already introduced the fact that the European Union has just adopted an European adaptation strategy. It's a strategy for Europe, but it's also a strategy that has a very strong international dimension, because it's clear that working on adaptation, we need also to work in the context of our international partnership with our partner countries. We really want to enhance the adaptation at the global level, and particularly in Africa. Now, increasing adaptation capacity is key. It's really key. We have listened all the debate during this week. It's really key for facing the increasingly frequent impact of climate change that we need to have, and supporting the acceleration of adaptation in Africa. It's clearly one of our big priority in our relationship with partner countries. You were asking about how to illustrate the key elements, and allow me to say that I very much appreciate the discussion that we will have with us, because really the focus when we talk about adaptation will have to be related on science and the data, on governance and the policy design, on policy implementation and project on the ground. And we really think that working on robust data and the risk assessment will be essential to progress in the domain of the adaptation. The second element will be focusing our work on improving governance and the policy design. And we know very well all the work that is ongoing now at the level of national adaptation plans, national determined contributions are key strategy that have to be prepared by the partners, and we are supporting different partners to work on the preparation of this national adaptation plan, because they are not ready. We can see clearly that almost 90% of the countries have not ready finalized their plan. This plan for us are very, very important, because we're talking about climate finance, and of course it will be essential that all the climate finance flow will be addressed through this adaptation national plan, and it's what we intend to do. We'll have in the next 7 years important finance. We have now a new financial instrument, Global Europe. We have taken strong commitments. Almost 35% of the budget will be dedicated to climate-related issues. And of course, when we look to this, we look to the mitigation, but we look also to adaptation. And we can say that almost 60% of all the funds will be dedicated to adaptation. So very important link between how we will use this fund on adaptation to the national determined contribution. So for us, the first key elements will be to prepare, to ensure to work with our partner on national determined contribution, on the national adaptation plan, in order to ensure that everything that we'll be able to finance in the next future years will be linked with the concrete implementation of this plan. Maybe I stop here and we'll come once again together for the next question.
Thank you, Carla. Frank?
Yes, thank you very much, Sally, and it's great to be here at the EU Pavilion in Glasgow at COP26. I would first like to introduce our audience to JPI Climate. JPI Climate is a joint programming initiative on climate change. and it was established just 10 years ago. Its objective is to coordinate and align research investments across the European research area. It has been very successful in doing this, and we are presenting 10 years of JPI Climate at another COP side event on Thursday afternoon. So any of you who are interested in finding out more can join us at that. Essentially, the member countries of JPI Climate are really investing a lot of effort and research in supporting development of information and knowledge to inform effective adaptation actions and for achievement of climate resilience. We're doing this through our support for fundamental sciences here in Europe and with our global partners through the Belmont Forum, which is a program which we work with partners throughout the world. As well as this, we are investing in cross-sector impacts and adaptation analysis in support and also support development of climate services, and we've done this with the cooperation of the European Commission through DG Research. We're also developing flagship partnerships with Africa and with Latin America. The European Climate Change Adaptation Conference, ECA, is a flagship event where scientists, policymakers and practitioners can share their knowledge and insights as well as the questions and challenges they have. ECA has a global partner also in the UNEP-supported Adaptation's Future Conference, and we can envisage growing synergies between ECA and Adaptation's Future. These are two major flagship events. JPI Climate co-created ECA 2021 with our colleagues in DG Research and with many experts in these areas. Like all our lives, ECA was impacted by COVID-19, but we adapted, and ECA 2021 took place as a series of virtual meetings and a high-level event in Brussels, which took place in June of this year. These all in combination showed important advances in our understanding of the complex challenges of climate change adaptation. And right now I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Hannah Knappen to provide some of the key messages and outcomes from ECA 2021. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Frank, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Now, Frank already introduced ECA 2021 to all of you, and the Cascades project, in which ECDPM, my organization, is a partner, was one of the 3 Horizon 2020 programs, together with JPI Climate, which, as we just heard, behind the organization of the last edition of ECA. Now, what did we learn from the series of webinars and the final high-level event? I will try to summarize this in 4 points. It's not very easy because so much has been said, but I would say that the first point is that there was a very strong focus on change. Urgent change is needed to finance, deliver and accelerate climate adaptation solutions at a time of unprecedented risks everywhere in the world, not only in Europe, not only in Africa, but everywhere. The second point is cooperation. That came back again and again. Cooperation is key. Society and governments within Europe can build on the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic to increase cooperation, and also building equal partnerships is crucial. A third point is the idea of a bottom-up approach and implementing this. Empowering people at every level through sharing knowledge and integrating indigenous knowledge in science and policy is the way forward. And this also nurtures a sense of ownership, which is so important for effective locally led adaptation. And the fourth point is the idea of inclusivity. So inclusion, sustainable solutions should leave no one behind. But of course, Europe cannot adapt alone to climate change. We are only as resilient as the most vulnerable among us. So Europe must support adaptation in partner countries that are heavily affected by climate impacts. And this is where the new and more ambitious European adaptation strategy agreed in February this year comes in. And Carla already mentioned the adaptation strategy, and that it also has a very important international dimension. I would like to talk a bit about this. This international dimension, to me, it can mean 3 things. So first, there is a very strong focus on small island development states and also least developed countries in Africa, and the Commission, as we just heard, will scale up international climate finance with a strong focus on adaptation. And it will also make sure to be more aligned with countries' priorities, such as the national adaptation plans. And Europe will also use its climate diplomacy more strongly to build stronger alliances with African countries. The second point, when it comes to the international dimension of the adaptation strategy, is that on the one hand, this strategy talks about locally led adaptation, but there is also a much stronger acknowledgement of the interconnectedness of the world. So concretely, it refers to the importance of understanding transboundary climate impacts and finding ways to respond to these. And I think Katie will talk more about that in a minute. And the third point is that Europe can lead by example, I believe that, and now it has also a much stronger focus on a climate just transition. So the new strategy brings justice to adaptation, but it also looks at adaptation in a much broader way beyond technical solutions. So it aims for integrating nature-based solutions, creating synergies with ecosystem restoration, biodiversity, water management, and health. And I think that's very important. But let me stop here, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And I hand over to Katie Harris, who is Senior Policy Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute and Director of Adaptation Without Borders.
Thanks so much, Sally, and thanks also to Hannah for teeing up some of my remarks. So I thought I'd just focus on trying to explain what we mean by transboundary or cascading climate risks. They can be quite technical to get your head around. To give you an example of one of these, and then talk a little bit more, building on Hannah's remarks, about how the new EU adaptation strategy acknowledges and addresses these sorts of risks. So when we talk about cascading or cross-border or transboundary climate risks, we're talking about the fact that climate change can impact a particular place or country around the world. And as a result of that country's connections or that place's interdependencies with others, it can end up having consequences that ripple out, that cross borders, that cascade to locations that might be very far away, even thousands of miles from the original impact, just like we're seeing right now as a result of the COVID pandemic. And we see this through the potential of climate change to disrupt global trade flows and supply chains, to bear consequences for international financial flows, such as FDI or remittances, to influence movements of people, for instance, by changing migration or tourism patterns, or to threaten flows of natural resources that are shared and traded between countries. So some of my esteemed colleagues on this panel are far better placed to speak than I am about how climate change is already impacting Africa's societies and economies and ecosystems. But I just wanted to give you one example of how climate change impacts from around the world could cascade into the continent, based on some research from SEI colleagues here today. And the story centres on Senegal and its import of rice. Now, rice is one of the most important staple foods in Senegal, and imports from countries like India, Thailand, Pakistan, and Vietnam have been considered superior in the past to rice grown domestically. Now, those countries that I mentioned in Southeast Asia produce a lot of their rice in low-lying coastal and delta zones that we know are really likely to be flooded, to be increasingly salinized as climate change causes sea levels to rise. So if countries in Asia produce less rice as a result of climate change, then this is clearly a huge concern for them, and it should and rightly be addressed in their national adaptation plans. But we also need to think about what happens in Senegal. And what happens if countries in Southeast Asia were to reduce their international exports in order to focus on their own food security, what we might consider a very legitimate resilience-building measure? In 2007, when India stopped its exports of rice, it sparked a chain reaction throughout global markets that led to prices skyrocketing 200% in Senegal and riots on the street. Now, despite potentially facing this scenario, there is very little that Senegal can currently do about it, because it ultimately depends on the success of adaptation measures taken many thousands of miles away in Asia. So we need to start better recognizing these effects, but also understanding the opportunities they bring. Adaptation investment in Southeast Asia could, in this case, be said to pay double dividends and exponentially increase the resilience of groups living many thousands of miles apart. So this will require much greater levels of cooperation on adaptation, much greater investment in to support international action and ambition on adaptation. And this will be required not only for Africa, but also for the countries upon which its resilience depends. So just to wrap up, this is why it's really encouraging that the new EU adaptation strategy specifically notes that even local climate impacts can have regional or global repercussions, that it recognizes that the EU already is and will increasingly be affected by climate impacts that originate outside Europe through these kind of cascading effects, and that it recognizes that we need to start understanding and preparing for these through the research of Horizon 2020 projects like Cascades. But it also recognizes that we must take a much more collaborative approach to adaptation, to invest in strengthening resilience the world over, not just because of the self-interests of EU member states, but also because this is about global solidarity. We need to start recognizing and really harnessing our global interdependencies. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you very much, Katie. Kwame.
Thank you very much, Sally, for the opportunity. I'm with the African Union Development Agency, which is the development agency of the African Union. And I would like to put this discussion into context. On Sunday, in my home country of Ghana, 3,000 people were rendered homeless due to tidal waves, and that swept them off their properties. And this is starting to look like a regular occurrence. On the continent, we have most of the mega cities dotted across along the coastline, and the implication is that with time we are going to lose most of these cities if we are not able to build the needed adaptive capacity to be able to withstand that. And it's not just within the urban communities alone. Even in rural communities where agriculture is the mainstay of a lot of people, yields are dropping, resulting in people having to migrate from their communities into urban centers and thereby clogging the urban system. And of course, that's the result of what we are seeing even across the Mediterranean, where young people are hungry and because they have to run away from their communities because they are not able to fend for themselves. So this is a clear and present danger for Africa as well as the rest of the world. And I'm happy with the slogan for the European Pavilion, which is from ambition to action. I think we have spoken too much. We need to put our feet on the ground and start acting. And in 2015, for instance, we had the African Union Heads of States and Government bring on board the African Adaptation Initiative. And this was not just a program, but it's because we have lived it in Africa. We witness this every day. We've seen people lose jobs. We've seen people lose their livelihood. So for us, this is clear, this is present, and it affects our daily lives. So that is why we place so much emphasis on climate adaptation. Within our discussions, mitigation is important, but our focus now is adaptation because it's affecting our very survival. That is why at the level of the African Union Development Agency, we have teamed up with a number of institutions, including the Walker Institute from the University of Reading, to establish an African Union Development Agency Center of Excellence on climate resilience and adaptation. The focus really is to help in generating knowledge from bottom up. We need to have women, farmers, local practitioners being able to generate own knowledge that we can upscale and then use around the continent. And secondly, also is the issue of building a capacity for innovation. Most of the time, we have innovations that come from outside the continent, out of context. The innovations need to be generated from the local conditions so that the communities are able to align themselves with these innovations and speak very much to it. So And that is one of the focus areas for the center. Secondly is the issue of knowledge sharing and peer learning from each other. These are very, very important because it will be good for instance, farmers to be able to learn from each other on the various climate-smart agricultural technologies and adaptation means to help increase their yield and also help with the mitigation efforts as well. And then thirdly, it's also to help us in developing capacity for climate finance. There was a recent study by the International Institute of Environment and Development, and it indicated that between 2003 and 2016, less than 10% of all funds for climate actions on the ground reach the local people. So it tells us that 90% gets lost within the intermediary institutions. So if we really want to have climate actions on the ground, we need to rethink the model of transferring funds to local communities. And once these local communities are able to access the resources, I'm sure we'll be able to build adaptive capacity on this. And then also, finally, is the issue of developing policies around climate adaptation. Again, we are working with the University of Reading to conduct a number of climate resilience and readiness audits in a number of countries so that programs are climate proofed, they are climate audited to ensure that the cost of construction, the cost of infrastructure, the cost of implementation of programs and projects are kept within cost. So these are some of the innovative things that we are doing, and hopefully we'll get other partners on board, especially from the EU, to be able to help with the work of the center. Thank you.
That's a fantastic insight, Kwame. Thank you very much. Christophe, can I move on to you?
Yeah. Thank you, Sally. Let me share with you an overview of Adaptation, a program led by AFD, the French the French Agency for Development, sorry, that was launched in 2017 to operationalize the Paris Agreement and to become a driving force in speeding up climate investment. We do that mainly through studies and capacity building activities. We were endowed with a grant of 30 million euros, and we work currently with 15 countries and regional organizations in Africa, mainly with least developed countries, with small island development states. We work through 3 different components: governance, public policies, and projects. The first component about governance is operated by Expertise France. It aims at supporting the strengthening of institutional capacities and climate governance for the implementation and the monitoring of NDCs. We support the emergence of tools, for example, to monitor and evaluate the NDCs for the ministries of environment in several countries, such as Senegal, for example. Component 2 about public policies is dedicated at fostering the adaptation into different public policies. For example, in Niger, we supported kind of revision or an update of the agriculture development national strategy so as to better include adaptation and decline it into action with some more than 40 projects that are for which the amounts necessary to implement them are also identified. The component 3 is trying to foster the emergence of projects on the ground through mainly feasibility and vulnerability studies. We thus are trying to give countries the means to mobilize international climate finance and to scale up their own action. Let me share with you some results that we have had so far. We have had 75 supports in the 15 countries and regional organizations that are partnered with Adaptation. Those supports are dealing mainly with agriculture and water, that are the traditional sectors for adaptation, but also for biodiversity, for example, in Madagascar, with climate services in Ivory Coast, with education in Senegal, with health in Ghana. And we tried also to explore innovative approaches, for example, with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States and ODI, about a forecast-based early action system at a regional scale. We have mobilized more than 500 experts. Among them, it can be noted that 40% of them were national experts and 30% of them are women. It can be a subject of discussion afterwards. We have produced, thus, a leverage effect on more than 580 million projects through 7 projects that are currently approved by the board of AFD. Those projects are funded by AFD or co-funded with the GCF, with the EU, or with counterparts. We have just launched a second phase here in COP26 yesterday that will be organized through a triptych: understanding, planning, investing. I think it can be also a good way to start the conversation between us, because it is the link between our different projects. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. Thank you to all of you. We've heard some really interesting examples of the aims of the partnerships, of a couple of case studies of how these are actually making a real world difference, and that's often something that we're very keen to highlight. So what I'd like to do now is to move over to our audience here in Glasgow and online for some questions. Do we have some questions from the audience first? If you'd like to introduce yourself and your organisation, and we don't have a roving mic for the audience, so if you can speak really clearly, that would be great.
I'll try after a long day. Thanks, Sally. I'm Pen Cabot, Business Development Director at Walker Institute, based at University of Reading. First of all, I'd like to say that we're delighted to be a partner of this event today. I'm very excited to hear the discussion. I kind of have an open question about partnerships generally. I think we're excellent at some kinds of partnerships, not so good at others. And what I feel is that there are gaps, particularly when it comes to the private sector engaging in some of these partnerships. Also finance and asset managers and asset holders and investment vehicles. So I just kind of wanted to throw it to any member of the panel to say, you know, how do we broaden our partnerships to include finance and the private sector in a positive way, because we can't do a lot of this stuff without them. So how do we do that better?
Thank you very much, Pen. So, panel, how do we broaden our partners to the finance and the private sector to benefit these partnerships? Carla, would you like to?
Many thanks. It's a really important question, because we know that everything that can be done in the adaptation world, it's looking only to public finance will never be enough, take into account the huge amount that is necessary in terms of investment. So clearly having the private sector intervene also in the adaptation will be crucial. And very much to see during these events in COP how big was the engagement and the positive engagement from the private sector. Now, at the level of European Union, what I want to underline that it's very, very important for us. We want to attract the private sector into this, and this is the reason why in the new financial instrument we have foreseen new financial instrument that will be dedicated to stimulate, to de-risk the intervention of the private sector once the private sector is ready to intervene in the most difficult countries, in the less developed countries, in order to stimulate also the intervention of the private sector. So we will put in place some with our European Sustainable Development Fund, the EFCD Plus, some funds through blended or guarantees instruments using our development financial institution, the EIB, the EBRD, but also National Development Financial Institution, that will be our intermediary in order to facilitate the existence of instrument that will allow the private sector to intervene in all this domain. So we talk about adaptation. Adaptation means also innovative instrument in everything that will be related to climate, look into the transport, look into the infrastructure, look into the energy. All these are domains where the private sector can really intervene. So if we put in place the little push to de-risk some intervention, we hope that the private sector will really be able to intervene also in this crucial domain.
Thank you. Kwame, can I ask you how can we approach that process of building confidence in investing and sustainable and in scaling up adaptation, innovation in the context of partnerships between Europe and Africa?
Thank you, and I would like to pick up from the point that Carla made. I mean, normally when we talk about private sector financing, I think most of the time we focus a lot more on institutional financing. But for instance, in Africa, the biggest investors in agriculture are small-scale farmers, and these are private people. The point is, how do you support these people to be able to also access finance? Women, for instance, I mean, they produce 75% of the food that is consumed on the continent, but they are more or less not part of the discussions when it comes to private financing. So I think it behoves on governments to make sure that the enabling environment and that's able to provide the necessary resources for women farmers in particular to be able to assess. And then on the issue of the innovations, I think what has been missing for a large part is that community people are most of the time not included or take part in the innovative processes. Scientists go to the field, take their research materials to the lab. When they are done, they tell you this is the way to go. But if we want communities to adopt and scale up some of these innovative practices, it needs to be on the field. Farmer to farmer learning processes are much quicker than anything that comes from the laboratory or from the research tables. So I think the research needs to be grounded within the context of the local communities. And when that is done, the communities will pick up when they see that there are results that have come out from those innovations. So you can go to some communities and, for instance, on agricultural production processes, they used to do these things way back from when their grandmothers were doing them. What needs to be done is for there to be some minor innovations to this. You don't go in there and dump a new process onto them. So I think that is where we have a bit of challenge. Once we involve the local communities and we build up from where they are, we should be able to increase the kind of innovations and productivity within the local communities.
Thank you. Christophe, do you want to come in briefly and then I'll go to Katie?
In 1 minute, I'd like to follow it up through a project that we have accompanied in Niger. We have made a feasibility study for a project for agropastoralism with numerous things on the ground, such as the work on 300 water wells for cattle, to foster transboundary agreements to facilitate the mobility of the cattle and the breeders, to work on 9 service centers for the farmers, for example, to to vaccinate cattle, and also to rehabilitate 6 cattle markets. I think that's quite concrete, and we are quite proud to have done that.
Excellent. Katie, briefly, if you may.
Just very briefly, I would just like to echo the comments earlier that we really need to see ambition move to action on adaptation, and this requires much greater investment for those facing the direct impacts on the front lines of climate change, and also to manage what I've been talking about here today, so these cascading climate risks. And I think the private sector can of course play and should play their role in that. But I think they need to go beyond that. And it's very interesting that the EU's new adaptation strategy introduces this concept of just resilience. And it perhaps sort of tacitly acknowledges that what might represent a strong resilience building measure or adaptation measure for some might actually have a trade-off and undermine the resilience of another. And you can imagine this in if you think about a company investing to strengthen the resilience of its supply chain, for instance, to climate risks, that might well have a real trade-off in the form of divesting from places that are high risk to climate change, that might have very real consequences for then smallholder farmers and producers, what Kwame was just talking about, that would see them hit twice. First from the impacts of climate change, and then because it's a threat to their livelihoods. So I think this also requires a private sector to really think about their business practices and to really think about the role they could play in strengthening resilience that brings benefits for everyone.
Thank you very much, Katie. And I'd like to go over to my JPI Climate colleague, Senior Science Officer Alex Fernandez, who's I think has some questions from our online audience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sally. Yes, there has been some questions and comments in the chat, so I would like to share them with the panel. So the first one is actually to Christophe. So it's a question by Borhane Mahajub, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. So the question is it too late to involve other partners in the Adaptation project? If yes, does AFD have future projects to propose? So this is the first very concrete question to Christophe. And then we have a comment by Bart van der Hurk from the Netherlands. And his comment is, these global rice trade examples show that a crisis has not only a physical environmental trigger, climate, pandemic, etc., but also a strong impact of the socio-economic response to these triggers, like export restrictions. And maybe I would direct this comment to Katie if she wants to comment on this. So this is all the questions we have in the chat, and
thank you, Alex.
Feel free to post some more. Thank you.
Christophe, so is it too late to involve other partners in the AFD adaptation programme?
It's not too late. We'll work on a second phase starting next year with a new grant of 15 million euros with 12 partner countries in Africa. We would like to capitalize or to use the lessons learned and the experience from the previous phase with the initial partner countries, but we'll probably have some space for new partner countries. We would like also to scale up the project in the medium term. So depending on the final budget, we'll be able to scale up and to target new partner countries.
Thank you very much, Christophe. And Katie, would you like to address the issue on the physical triggers?
Well, just to say that I would agree, and I think when you look at risk in the round, you absolutely it doesn't stop at the physical climate trigger. It as Bert said, it moves into the socio-economic systems, and I think this has real implications for the sorts of climate risk assessments that we do, and we don't yet have very much data or very many tools that really allow us to identify, track, measure, monitor, assess sort of cascading climate risks, either that might be originating within Europe or indeed within Africa. But they have real consequences. They're happening now, and we can't wait until we have perfectly robust methods. Perhaps it requires us to be open to a different type of climate risk assessment and to use different tools for climate risk disclosure, and to really begin to experiment and also think about the different uses for the adaptation communications that we already have. So, for instance, we think a lot about national adaptation plans, sort of reporting what countries are doing on adaptation, but we could also start thinking about them as a basis to understand their interdependencies with others and how adaptation actions themselves could also have cascading effects. So I think, these complex risks that might start with an initial physical trigger, but then propagate through systems, human socioeconomic systems, require us to innovate in our ability to understand them, and we have to do it quickly because they're happening now.
Thank you very much, Katie. Frank, are these the sorts of issues that can be accelerated through discussions on forums where we are sharing information and knowledge, and where we are trying to move these issues forwards, such as ECHA and Adaptation Futures?
Absolutely. I think these are the very issues that we need to explore. We need to learn more about. All of this, we're very much in a learning by doing situation here on climate change, and climate change impacts don't discriminate between the public sector, the private sector, and the more we can learn from those type of examples that we've heard here and explore them in greater detail. I mean, why are we losing 90% of the funding before it actually becomes tangible for the people who need it most? That's an interesting question. We need to explore those barriers, how to overcome those barriers, and I suppose this is quite fundamental to, I suppose, the Paris Agreement and its 3 goals. Obviously, the 3rd goal there is about the financial flows and ensuring that they are directed to enable us to have low emission, climate resilient futures. And I think we have to keep those goals in mind and do the hard work of analysing the situations that we've heard here, but share that learning. And that's why we need fora like the ECHA meetings every 2 years, that we bring together the policymakers, the scientists, the practitioners, to share those learning insights and also the questions that are arising out of what they're doing, so then we can go the next step. So we need this sort of iterative process by which we systematically work through this problem, because we have to work through this problem together. So at a European level, ECHA, at a global level, the Adaptation's Future Conference, I think, are key to that type of process.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question from the audience? Yes, thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I just want to give 2 examples of cascading risks.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Tim Benton, Research Director at Chatham. 2 examples of cascading risks, and ask the panel what lessons we've learned. So the first one, 2010, Eastern European drought, food price rises, Syrian drought, sparkling Arab Spring, civil war in Syria, people movement into Europe, rise of nationalism, blah, 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 Brexit. 10-year risk cascade. Second one, COVID. COVID almost certainly has a signature of climate change in terms of ecological rewiring, coupled with land use change. We expect from the ecological perspective to have more emerging pests and diseases because of climate change impacts and land use impacts. Great example of a cascading risk. So given those 2 examples, what would the panel say we've learned about resilience building in the future, and how might we enable that to happen to go from ambition to action as per Kwame's content?
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to keep your answers very brief, because I've got another question I want to take next, unless it's similar.
No, thank you very much. My name is Obed. I'm from the African Academy of Sciences. I want to commend the organizations represented by the panelists and the great work that you're doing. I just wanted to mention that not all climate change is bad, and so even as we put together interventions, we also need to be aware that some of this brings opportunities that will be tapped. In the Horn of Africa, for example, the rainfall is supposed to be going up in terms of intensity. So that is predominantly a net drought area. So that even as we handle flooding, how do we then tap these opportunities to be able to be a net producer rather than a net that being in the Horn of Africa? And through the discussions and the interactions that we had with people like JPI Climate through the CCA project, we realized that some of the regions have different priorities and different needs. So as we do interventions, being diverse as we are, how do we then make sure that we are able to bring everyone on board?
Lovely. Thank you very much. I don't know if it's possible to address answers to both very good questions, or to weave one into the other. Christoph, can I start with you?
Maybe I'd like to underline the fact that we need to better work on the science policy interface. That's the word we were close to mention before. Both to ensure that policymakers are enlightened, I would say, by scientists, but also that scientists can better hear what the policymakers need. And that's the reason why we chose to have this triptych: understanding, planning, investing for the second phase, to ensure that all those different people work better together. Knowledge sharing will be important also. That was mentioned. ICA is probably a great place. We would like also to foster knowledge streams from the south to the north. There are things that we do currently with our partner countries that doesn't exist in Europe.
So how is that going to address these two issues raised here?
I think I would prefer my fellows to answer.
Kwame.
Yes, thank you. I think on the issue that was raised, the resilience component, because when issues such as the COVID happens, it's transboundary. It affects each and every one of us. So if we are better able to collaborate, share information, I mean, the European community or the European Union has had a lot of research on the issues around climate change, for instance, and we can have that collaboration with African research institutions, for instance, so that the research that is generated is also Africa-specific. African researchers working very closely with European researchers for us to understand the climate change phenomenon better, because it keeps changing every now and then. It's important that continuous research takes place. And I think once this is done, we'll be able to, on the research side, we'll be able to address the issues around climate change. And then moving on to the other issue that my friend talked about. I mean, the Horn of Africa, we realize, as he indicated, the rainfall patterns are changing, and which is a good thing. But we need to put in the capacity to ensure that it does not result into flooding, for instance. How do we channel this new resource that we are getting into a productive venture? So I think research, for instance, is going to help us to be able to do that. We need to have a lot more research, on the ground kind of research, which should then be channeled into implementation. That is the key word that we've consistently missed out of this climate discourse: implementation. We've done so much of research, we need to see it on the ground.
So climate-informed infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And Katie, what about this issue of multiple risks?
Well, I mean, I think COVID-19 has awoken us to the sort of the interconnected and interdependent nature of the world. And we all knew it, right? We've been talking about globalization for a long time, but I think it's really reminded us that our fates are intertwined as such. And I think I hope we will learn the lessons from that, and to also understand that climate change can present a similar sort of threat globally, but But I think in terms of the lessons I hope we would draw from that, it's that adaptation has to be, as I've said many times, it has to be much more cooperative. It has to be much more collaborative. It involves us working together, and it involves us really equipping those adaptation planners, that locally led agenda, with this global understanding, with this knowledge that they need to then be able to implement locally led solutions. And that's how you can both address some of the challenges that climate change will pose, but also harness any opportunities that exist. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Frank, did you want to?
Yes. What I would say is, and you've listed off what is a very rich list of examples: COVID, Brexit, extreme weather, climate. We have to learn from those. We have to study those. We have to see this. And the framing for that study has to be risk and resilience. And we have to understand how to manage that risk, how to maintain resilience, because essentially we at least have to maintain the level of resilience we have now for the future. We really need to enhance that, but the bottom line is we need to at least maintain what we have. And the other one is an interesting point, and I think that goes into the transition and transformation, where we are going through a global transition. We will transform into a different world. We don't know how much different it will be, but we certainly need to understand that transition and to be able to manage that transition. If we do not manage it, it will manage us. And that's where we need to build on what we've learned and what we're still learning about all of those things that have evolved. The political instability, the economic instability, the movements of people, all of those things. We need to be able to analyze those and learn from them and use that learning very rapidly. And that's what processes like ECHA, I suppose, can do, bring knowledge to policy. And it's not just policies, practitioners at all scales.
Lovely, thank you very much. And one more question. Did you have a question? If you would just...
My name is Olivia Lazard. I work for Europe on the geopolitics of... Hi. My name is Olivia Lazard. I work for Carnegie Europe on the geopolitics of climate and transitions. And I have a comment and a question.
We're going to have to ask you to be very quick, I'm afraid.
So I think that the challenge that we're facing is indeed analyzing risks from an interdependency perspective, as you were saying, Katie, and to make sure that we also categorize risks differently, because the Brexit story is happening on a very, very long time scale. Whereas, Katie, you speak of interdependencies between food systems, energy systems, labor systems across geographies. They're happening very, very quickly. So I suppose that my question is mostly directed at the people who are working for the European Union, for the AFD, which is how are your analytical systems changing and reflecting now those interdependencies and therefore affecting your budget lines and your programmatic deployment lines, particularly on the basis of cascades and other types of projects.
I'm afraid I've only got time to come to you to answer that, Carla, and I think we've got a couple of seconds left, and that question deserves longer.
Okay, yes, it's the question is very long and complex, but we have clearly in mind that is interlinkage between the different subjects and everything that we mention here, take into account the food transformation, the integration. It's clearly all the subjects are interlinked. So what I will say, it's analysis, it's knowledge, it's the data, it's the risk assessment tools, it's the increased capacity to analyze all this data will be essential, and this will be an essential part of our job.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have time for any more questions, and I'm sure it was quite a short answer. But we do have some very clear and valuable take-home messages this evening. We do need to exchange between us more knowledge and information. Everyone recognises that. The Paris Agreement recognises that, and I think we've all agreed on that today. Our organisations are increasing research cooperation beyond Europe, as the title of the session suggests. And we meet here on a global pathway that we all travel to climate decisions, to the achievement of climate resilience. And JPI Climate and all our organisations will continue their work, but all of us need to increase partnerships across Africa, to extend the dialogue between science and practitioners, such as we see at ECHA and the Adaptation Conference. And I just want to say thank you so much to our audience online and here in Glasgow, and to our fantastic panellists, to our great team of technicians. This session has been recorded, so you can review it and share it with colleagues to extend the discussion on adaptation beyond the EU, perspectives for a stronger cooperation with Africa. Just use the replay button on the COP EU side events website, and please join me in thanking our panellists.